What's up everyone, my name's William, and today we're going to be going over the reverb effects that are included in Logic. So I've opened up a new session and I've just made a couple of tracks for each of the reverb effects, and I also have a track with no reverb effect on it. I'm using the Carla Lyric 02 audio sample again. I just went to Apple Loops, vocals. I just searched for vocals, and then it was the third one here, Carla Lyric 02. So first, before we get started, let's just listen to what this sounds like without any effects on it.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh.
Okay, so that's what our vocal sounds like. And jumping right into it, we're going to first cover the Enverb effect. So this is the Enverb effect. It's the first one of 4 reverb effects that we're going to be covering. So you just go down to an empty audio effect slot, go down to reverb, and then click on Enverb. And then this is the box that should open up. So I'm going to load up the aggressive tail preset, just make sure everything is like the preset says. And now, just before we even cover any of this, let's just listen to what this preset has done to our sound. So obviously that's done quite an effect. It's added quite a bit of reverb to our vocal. So covering this effect, it can be broken down into 3 sections, this effect. It can be broken down into time parameters, which is this upper area right here. It can be broken into the sound parameters, which this is the actual, what controls our sound, the reverb. And then we can also have our mix section, which controls our mixing between our dry and wet signals. So, we're going to kind of just do an overview. I mean, when working with, any of these reverb effects, it's all about, being creative with it and experimenting and coming up with, your own presets and things, and also exploring some of the presets that are included in Logic. But covering these time parameters first, we have a simple ADSR. We have attack up here, and we can also click around on this to drag the points, or we can just click and drag up and down on each of the corresponding parameters, attack, decay, sustain, and release, all at the top here. So we have our attack, which determines how long it takes for our reverb to attack. The decay is, again, controlling the reverb decay, the sustain level of our reverb, and then the release of the reverb, how long it takes to fade out. Next, at the bottom, we also have a dry signal delay. So, we could do a weird thing if we wanted the reverb to come in before the vocal. You can do some weird things with that. We also have a pre-delay, which, it gives us a little bit of a break before the reverb actually happens. So you can get some cool effects with that as well. And then we also have hold, which just it determines how long you're holding that sustain level. You can do a max of 1,000 milliseconds and a minimum of 10 for that. So these are all the time parameters. It's pretty straightforward. Basic ADSR. Everything that is green is controlling the reverb. This blue value here is controlling the dry signal. Moving down to our actual sound. Down here, these sound parameters. We first, have this density knob. It determines how dense our reverb is. So just listening, I'm going to load up the aggressive tail again. Reset all these time parameters first. I'm going to turn all the density all the way down, and we'll listen to what that sounds like. Has a very weird effect. Now, if I turn it all the way back up, we can hear, the differences there. So that's what the density knob does. It determines how dense our reverb is, and we get a visual representation of how colored in this envelope is. How transparent it is with this green color. Next, we have spread. This is just a simple stereo spread of our reverb, how much it's spread across the stereo image. 100% is our default spread. 0% is a monophonic reverb. And then 200% is just an artificial, spread of the reverb, to twice as much as the actual stereo image. The default for this preset was set to 160. So again, 160 for the spread sounds like this. Now I'm going to turn it all the way down. I'm actually going to turn off the dry signal real quick just so we can hear it better. Now all the way up. Now at 100. It's a little bit tricky to tell the difference, especially with this specific reverb, but it just controls the spread of the reverb. Moving on to high cut, this determines where we are, cutting off, the lows when it comes to, the highs when it comes to our reverb. So if we have it all the way up, again, I'm gonna just solo out our wet signal here. So it determines, where our high cut is happening in our reverb. Next, we have this crossover knob, which determines where it considers low frequencies, in short. So if we want everything under 1,000 hertz to be considered a low frequency, we would just set that here. And then this kind of corresponds with this next knob. We set our low frequency level. So if you want to reduce the low frequencies, because that's a common practice among reverb, just so it doesn't muddy up the original signal as much, it kind of just adds to it. We can reduce the low frequencies of our reverb. And again, we determine what is considered a low frequency, because everything below this number on our crossover knob will be affected by our low frequency level knob. So that's about it for these sound knobs, and I've been using these a little bit. Dry, wet for these two sliders here determines how much of the dry signal you're getting and how much of the wet signal. If I turned dry signal all the way up and wet all the way down, we're just getting the dry signal almost as if the effect was off. If we're doing the opposite of that, turning the dry all the way down and turning the wet all the way up, we get just the reverb. We don't get any dry signal. And for this preset, we actually had a nice even split between them, which it sounds like this. So you can hear the differences there. But yeah, that's about it for the Enverb. It's a pretty straightforward reverb effect. It's definitely a very cool, simple reverb to mess around and experiment with. Next, we are going to be moving on to the Platinum Verb reverb effect. Before we get into it, let's again listen to what this sounds like with a dry signal. I'm just going to turn off the Platinum Verb. We're going to listen to our dry signal.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh.
So that's what our dry signal sounds like. And the Platinum Verb is different than the Enverb in the way that you're able to edit things like the early reflections and reverb separately, whereas Enverb was just the reverb tail that you were editing. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to go over some of these parameters, and then we're going to kind of mess with them using some of these factory presets. So first, let's recall the default, and we're going to listen to what the default preset sounds like for this verb.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh, get up.
Okay, so that's what it sounds like with the Platinum Verb on. First of all, before we get into too many of the other parameters, we can split this up into multiple sections just like we could the other one. This square here is full of the early reflections parameters. Down here, all of this is the reverb parameters. This box right here is the balance between the early reflections and the reverb, excuse me. And then this is also a little bit of a visual representation for our room. And lastly, we have our mix, our dry and wet balance here. Now, the thing about this is we're actually, kind of trying to mimic a real room, and that's what this platinum verb is meant. It's meant to mimic a room, a space, something like that. So first, before we covered any of the other parameters, I wanted to cover this balance ER/reverb slider. So what this does is it balances between the early reflections and the reverb. So, if we just wanted the early reflections, we could just set it all the way to the left. Just the reverb tail, we could set it all the way to the right. And for this factory default preset, we have it at 50/50. So we're going to be taking advantage of that parameter in order to, hear the differences that we're making with the early reflections and the reverb. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to listen to what just the reverb and early reflections sound like together without the dry signal. So I'm going to disable the dry signal over here and turn the wet all the way up. Again, this is our basic mixing parameters, dry and wet signal. We determine how much of each we want to hear. So let's just listen to that. So that's what our reverb, our platinum verb, by itself sounds like with our early reflections and reverb together, since we have this balance between them at 50/50. So let's first go over the early reflections parameters. Since we're doing that, I'm going to put the balance between early reflections and reverb all the way to early reflections. And before we change anything, let's listen to what the factory default sounds like.
Get up, get up, get up, get up. Get up, get up. Oh.
So this is used to kind of try to mimic a room. You can see we have pre-delay, which determines the delay before the early reflections happen. We also have room shape. This determines how many sides the room has.
Get up, get up. Get up, get up.
You can see, the difference between 3 sides and 7 sides is quite different. And then there's also this stereo bass, which this is actually mimicking the distance between 2 virtual microphones in this room that we've made, to try to get a recording for the early reflections of the sound. And then we can also, so let's listen to what this sounds like again.
Get up, get up.
And then when the stereo bass is all the way at 0.
Get up, get up. Get up, get up. Get up, get up.
So you can hear the differences that happen as I adjust that slider. Moving on to room size, I'm just going to change that as we're going, as we're playing through the file, so we can hear what that does.
Get up, get up. Get up, get up. Get up, get up. Oh.
So you can hear, as we increase the room size, the tail gets a lot longer for that. And that's what our early reflections are. It's just kind of mimicking the room and the setup we have for the room. Now I'm going to switch over to just the reverb tail. A lot of these reverb settings are actually pretty similar to what we saw in Enverb. So first we have the initial delay of the reverb. It determines how long it takes for the reverb to occur. Then we have the stereo spread of our reverb, and we have this crossover again, which determines what is considered low frequencies. Moving on to the low ratio slider, this actually sets the reverb time relative to the high and lower bands, because of course we set the high and lower bands with this crossover. Everything under 300 hertz is the low band, everything above it is the high band. When you're at 100%, they're identical. Obviously, when you get more, it's the low band has a greater time, greater than the high band. Low frequency level, again, is just a level adjustment of the low frequencies. Typically, when working with reverb, you take down the low frequencies a little bit. Then we again have our high cut adjustment, our reverb density slider, diffusion of our reverb tail. You really have to balance this with the density slider to get cool effect. Here, let me show you what it sounds like this, and then I'll adjust the diffusion tail, or excuse me, the diffusion slider. So now, if I turn this all the way down, you can hear the differences in those sounds by adjusting the diffusion slider. And lastly, the reverb time just affects how long the reverb goes. You know, if we did short, you know, the differences in that is pretty obvious. It had around 2.5 or so for their reverb tail, for their reverb tail time, excuse me. That's about it for Platinum Verb. It's a little bit more complex than Enverb, but that's just because it gives you more control over the different parameters with the reverb. Moving on. Next, we're going to be covering Silver Verb. So Silver Verb, it has some similar parameters to Platinum Verb, but we just went over because you're kind of controlling a virtual room in a sense. Considering this box is all the room parameters. But one thing that's different is you get some modulation features. There's an LFO built into this Silver Verb that you can control. So without doing anything, I'm going to make sure this is the factory default setting, and it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the dry signal. I'm going to turn the effect off real quick, and then we're going to listen to what the Silver Verb is doing.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh.
So that was the dry effect, you know, without any of the Silver Verb on. Now let's listen to it with this Silver Verb on.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh. Get up.
So that's what the Silver Verb is doing right now. And of course, I've kind of already mentioned this, but again, this reverb is broken down into 3 sections. You know, it's broken down into the room parameter section, modulation parameters, and the output parameters, like the other reverbs that we've encountered. You know, it has a dry wet mix right there. So going over just the room parameters, you know, pre-delay again is the delay between, you know, when the sound is playing and when the reverb is starting. When the dry sound is starting to play and when the reverb is starting to play. Excuse me. Reflectivity determines the amount of reflective, you know, harmonics that are happening in this virtual room that we're simulating here. Next, we also have the size of the room that we can change, and after that, we also have this density/time knob, which determines how dense and how long our reverb tail is going to be. You know, then one thing, you know, else is we also have a high cut slider like we've been seeing on a lot of these other things, on these other reverbs. But one thing that's different is we actually also have a low cut you know, reverb slider, so we can cut off the lows as well as the highs. So you know, we get a lot more control over what is actually being listened to when we're controlling the room parameters over here. Moving on to the modulation parameters, let's just listen to the wet signal real quick. So as you can see, the modulation knobs were changing how it sounded with the tail of that reverb. So you can get some cool effects with this modulation, and of course you can turn it on and off with this power button here. And we have, just a simple rate knob that controls the rate of our LFO, intensity slider that controls how much it's affecting our signal. And we also have this phase knob, which determines the phasing of our LFO. When we're at 180 or negative 180, it's practically the same thing. When we're at 0, it's both the phase is lining up, the phase is opposite. So what's happening on the left is the opposite on the right, and vice versa. And moving on to the last section, we have just the output parameters, which we have our dry and wet signals that we can mix between, determine how much of the dry signal we want to hear and how much of the wet signal we want to hear. Very simple reverb that we have here. Not too much going on, just messing with the room parameters, and if you want to add that modulation in, I mean, that's one of the special things about this silver verb. Now, we're going to move on to Space Designer, which by far, just from looks, it looks like the most complex of the 4 reverbs that are included in Logic. Even though Space Designer does look complex, it just allows us to have a lot more control over the reverb we're making. So jumping right in, Space Designer, you literally are creating a reverb tail type of reverb using a IR sample. So what you can do is again, I'm on the factory default, you click on the IR sample mode, and you can actually load up different IRs, which they have a bunch of preset ones in these folders. Also, I believe any wave file can be used as an IR sample, and this is just the sample that's used to create our reverb. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually not use the IR sample mode, though. We're going to use the synthesized IR, which it's just one that the Space Designer kind of comes up with in itself. And also clicking this multiple times adds slight variations. As you can see, when I'm clicking on the synthesized IR button, it's changing the reverb slightly, just to give us a very unique sound every time. But it's allowing us to create a reverb from scratch, essentially. I know that's not technically what's happening, but it's the closest we can get. It's allowing us to take a sample and create a reverb tail with that sample. So we have some more controls over here in our sample control. We also can control the sample rate. This is more so used for when we're using the IR sample mode. It just controls the sample rate. You can get some unique sounds, especially when you combine this with the preserve length button, which the preserve length button tries to preserve the length of the default sample. So, for example, when we're on our synthesized sample here, what's happening is the length is at 2. When I half the sample rate, it's going to 4, 8 for 8 seconds, 16 seconds. So if I click preserve length, as I'm changing this, the length is still being preserved even though the sample rate is changing. So that's something cool. You combine the sample rate changes with preserved length, you can get some interesting sounds. Honestly, I usually don't typically mess with sample rate too much, just because you get weird artifacts, or you tend to get weird artifacts sometimes. But that's just my preference. Of course, you can do whatever you want. Adjusting the sample rate and preserved length, can add some cool stuff to your reverb. Moving on from this, because this is going to be the first thing you're going to want to look at when you're working with Space Designer. But moving on, you have a bunch of different settings here. The next thing that I would look at is this stereo, mono, and surround settings right here. So what this is it adjusts whether or not our reverb is going to be stereo, mono, or whether the stereo image is going to be inverted. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm going to keep it on stereo for right now. And before we, go any further, let's just listen to what our reverb sounds like.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh.
So we could hear our reverb there. And, where most of the magic happens is right here. This is where we're going to be controlling our volume envelope, our filter envelope, our density envelope, and our EQ. And also if we want to reverse this at all, we can click that button there. So what happens here is, that's what our reverb sounded like.
Get up, get up.
We can actually change with either this parameter box down here. We can adjust our parameters, or we can actually just click on some of these nodes and drag around. So what we're going to do is I'm going to move this around, and now let's hear what our reverb sounds like.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up.
So it has a much slower attack and it kind of fades in. It sounds pretty cool. So again, we can control our envelopes, because no matter what envelope we click on, this box down here is going to be our parameters for it. We have the different parameters that we can just simply adjust here. We also have these buttons, exponential and linear. Exponential is a more natural sounding decay curve, whereas linear is more, it's linear, but it's less natural sounding. And we can get the visual representation when we're clicking on these. Next we have, end level, and of course we have all of these different parameters with each of these envelopes. So that's about it for the, this center panel. Definitely mess around with this, mess around with the different presets, but it's just adjusting, our different volume envelopes, our filter envelope, which we will use in conjunction with this in a second, as well as our density for our reverb. And density isn't used when we're talking about an IR sample. It's only used with a synthesized IR. So that's just something to keep in mind. But moving on, next we have the filter that I mentioned. The filter is, just a simple filter that we can turn on and off. We can adjust what type of filter it is. And we have a resonance adjustment as well. And all we do is we control it just like we did with the volume envelope. We can control it. And I'm actually going to do a similar envelope to our volume one.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh. Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Oh.
So we got some weird effects happening now with the filter. It's, it's coming in, it's going out, and it's coming in even stronger. Adjust the volume, bring up the initial level a bit maybe.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up.
So we got a weird wave kind of sound happening. It sounds pretty cool. Of course, I'm not going crazy in depth with some of these parameters. It's a lot of experimentation. There's a ton of presets included with with Space Designer that you can go and experiment with. Next we have some global parameters that we have seen before. We have pre-delay, spread, IR start, which when we're using our IR sample, it determines when it starts, whether there's going to be a delay or not. And also we have this X over feature, which determines our crossover between our bands on our synthesized IR. Lastly, we have this simple dry wet again. So dry determines how much of dry signal we're going to be hearing. REV stands for reverb, determines how much of the reverb we're going to be hearing in our signal. A lot of parameters with Space Designer. It's definitely the most complex of the 4 reverbs. There's not much to it though, even though it looks complex. I mean, it's mainly just fine-tuning either an IR sample or a synthesized IR you have using the different envelopes that they give you, and then really just tweaking it. You can adjust what type of filter you have, and then just some simple global parameters that you can adjust. So again, even though it looks complex, it's nothing that we haven't seen before. It's just multiple envelopes that we're working with. Of course, we have an EQ. I didn't really mention this, but it's just a simple EQ. We've seen EQs before, and we can turn those on, or turn these different bands on by clicking on the button, adjusting the gain or the Q of these bands. We can also, of course, click and drag the points that we have around. So that's just the basic EQ. You can also just turn on and off the EQ by pressing this button. But a lot of different things that we can mess with. Nothing we haven't seen before, especially, most of this stuff we've actually covered in previous reverbs. The main difference is just this IR sample feature, which it's a little confusing at first to get your head around, but it's just using a sample to create our reverb that we're going to be building off of. So again, my name is William. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you have questions about any of these, definitely talk to your mentor, call a recording connection. Again, my name is William. Thank you for watching.